So infrastructure is an important part of an economy. And of course, here in Australia, we've got some big infrastructure projects at play, which will no doubt increase our productivity, which will no doubt increase prosperity. Welcome to the Urban Property Investor. I'm your host, Sam Saggers, here to help you crack the code of real estate wealth. Today's show, code cracking stuff. We're going to dig into infrastructure. Does it actually create capital growth? Let's have that chat. I always think the infrastructure conversation is a compelling one. The world at times gets renovated. Does that renovation of the urban public realm create with it a level of productivity and growth? Let's go into the cause and effect of infrastructure. I think it's very worthy of the Urban Property Investor podcast. After all, we live in an urban world, most of us. Today, almost 51% of planet Earth lives in an urban world. And of course, that is going to continue to rise. By mid-century, 75% of the world's population will be living urban. So let's do this, folks. Welcome back, regulars. You know the drill. Play the program in double speed, get your life back. And of course, all the episodes I've done are lessons on real estate, so feel free to go back in time. Now we've got that out of the way, let's talk shop. Let's go into the conversation around the cause and effect of infrastructure. And really, the proposition today is, can infrastructure create capital growth? And of course, let's really analyze infrastructure. Infrastructure can be roads, it can be trains, new airports. It can be infrastructure based on housing. It can be infrastructure based on any form of advancement to the economy and public realm. And really, if you think about the idea of growth of GDP, it is around productivity. And of course, infrastructure can create with it a betterment of productivity. And when it comes to really the idea of running an economy, you really can sell your products, you can increase productivity, or you can increase your population base. Really, they are the 3 Ps of an economy. And of course, all of that, if you've got a good level of productivity, if you're increasing your population and providing more taxpayers to the economy, and of course, if you're able to sell your products, you're going to equalize out with more prosperity. And infrastructure obviously plays a big role in supporting all 3 of those Ps. If you can have better infrastructure, you're going to get your products to the world market a lot quicker. If you've got better infrastructure as a backbone, you will be able to house more people in your economy and grow your economy off the sheer scale of more people buying more things, producing more stuff. And of course, that infrastructure, without question, is an ability to create more productivity, more ways to do things more efficiently. And productivity is definitely a measurement that Australia needs to improve upon. And it's probably fair to say our infrastructure at times is certainly not as compelling as some of the rest of the world. You can go to Europe and use fast rail to get around from country to country. You can go to Japan and take the Shinkansen, fast rail across the country in no time. You can do similar things in China. You can take a train from literally the center of Shanghai to its airport, circa 70 kilometers, and the train travels at light speed and gets you there in 10 minutes. All of that world-class infrastructure creates a level of productivity. If we can do things faster, quicker, more efficiently, we can see society's economic growth and prosperity increases. So infrastructure is an important part of an economy. And of course, here in Australia, we've got some big infrastructure projects at play, which will no doubt increase our productivity, which will no doubt increase prosperity. And I've sort of spoken about this before, the idea that real estate is very much connected to getting a free ride off the back of these big productivity plays through infrastructure. Now, I've been the beneficiary of productivity plays through infrastructure, and I've taken a free ride from infrastructure in the past. Now, if anyone's ever played the game Monopoly, you would have played a board game where you simply go around Go and you buy houses and form hotels and add value to real estate in all sorts of way. But one of the cards you can pick up if you land on chance or community chest is you can take a free ride to a nearest train station. You can take a free ride around Go. You can take a free ride to Trafalgar Square. Basically, you can move up and grow faster through that free ride effect from Parker Brothers Monopoly board game. Now, I am a big fan of the game. I think it does simulate some of the best things about real estate, and taking a free ride is one of the best things about real estate. Now, an example in my portfolio, I took a free ride off productivity and infrastructure back in 2014. Basically, in 2014, as a human being, I did nothing useful for society whatsoever. I woke up, I did nothing that improved the world. But society did something useful for me and a few other people who happen to own real estate in an area being affected by an upgrading of infrastructure. Yes, infrastructure costs a lot of money, and because it costs a lot of money, it is very selective on where infrastructure goes. We have a national board here in Australia called Infrastructure Australia. They kind of earmark jobs as to where Australian taxpayer money should go when it comes to infrastructure upgrades. And of course, each state and territory has a similar body that also identifies where infrastructure should go. And because of that selective approach of infrastructure, not every infrastructure project that is needed sees the light of day. Now, back in 2014, I happened to own some real estate very close to a light rail network which was being activated in Sydney. Sydney's light rail network, or the tram if you like, was being extended out to a suburb called Dulwich Hill. Now, Dulwich Hill, to get to Dulwich Hill previously, you would have to basically take the bus. Dulwich Hill sits about sort of 7 or 8 kilometres from the city of Sydney. It's a very, very nice suburb. But from a productivity point of view, to live in Dulwich Hill and catch the bus to the city and to get to work on time and be part of a productive society, it wasn't an easy thing to do. But all of a sudden, the state government in New South Wales planted the light rail or tram to the suburb of Dulwich Hill. And of course, the correlation effect of literally $1 billion light rail tram line coming to Dulwich Hill transformed the value of Dulwich Hill. Now, all of the people inside of Dulwich Hill did not pay for the $1 billion tram upgrade to their neighborhood. No, taxpayers paid for that. And of course, a lot of that was paid for by selling public utilities like the electricity company. And so that upgrade of infrastructure had a correlating effect of property values booming in really the inner west back in 2014. And by way of example, realestate.com has an article which basically you can go back and sort of source if you wanted to have a look at what I'm talking about. The headline is "Light Rail is the path to property boom." Sorry, I'll say that again. Light rail is the path to the property boom in the inner west. And what it is saying is the median house price in January 2013 for Dulwich Hill was $765,000. 9 months later, the figure had jumped to $1.3 million off the back of the Sydney Light Rail network coming to the suburb of Dulwich Hill. Now, I've mentioned this story before, and I've mentioned the concept, which I think is an important concept in real estate before, which is free riding. Free riding occurs when an individual, basically me in this particular situation, got an appreciation of their property's value, which I did. I had a property literally 1 minute from the light rail stop. And I got a free ride of capital growth, not because I did anything for society, but society's collective efforts of tax created a capital growth rate for me. I took a free ride from infrastructure, just like the Monopoly board, just like simply going around the Monopoly board. And in my 4X growth plan, this is known as an unearned increment of capital growth. Now, remember, my 4X growth plan is an important plan for creating capital growth in the marketplace. If you're not familiar with my 4X growth plan, it's really simple. The growth that you can get on a property is broken down into 4 drivers. You can get market growth. The real estate market can go up. You can get deal growth. You can add value to property. You can get location growth, and you can get behavioral growth or growth from real estate having its own scarcity or differentiations from other real estate. Now, in the 4X growth plan, market growth is broken down in a few elements. Inside of market growth, you've got population growth, you've got infrastructure growth, and you've got employment growth, all which drive the market. The market is driven off drivers. And again, if we were to look at some earned ways to create capital growth, in other words, a productive effort made by the property investor creates the capital growth. Well, you as a property investor can't really shift the market. So you can't actually create a level of growth yourself from the marketplace. But a property investor can add value to property through a deal. You can do a subdivision, a renovation, a pre-construction deal. They can build. It's all a way to add value. So that is known as earned growth. When it comes to market growth, it is really an unearned principle. You don't do anything, but you receive the benefit of it. Inside market growth, you've got infrastructure. And again, if you can highlight where the zoning effects of infrastructure are going to create an uplift of productivity, you can create unearned growth that you really don't do anything to the real estate yourself. 26 other million taxpayers do the heavy lifting for you. Now, if we go back to the Dulwich Hill story of the light rail, the tram, at the time there was probably about 22 million Australians paying some form of tax, or at least those in the workplace were. They paid for the tram for the light rail of Dulwich Hill. And again, do all of those 22 million people have the opportunity to use that track? Yeah, of course they do. Will they? No, of course they won't. So who is the beneficiary? Just the small amount of people inside of that Dulwich Hill line are the beneficiary. What does it do to property values? Well, it pushes property values up. It's an unearned piece of growth from a property investor's perspective. Now, earned growth and unearned growth are part of my Forex growth plan. I will touch on it. Basically, market growth is an unearned increment of growth. Deal growth, adding value to real estate, is an earned increment of growth. Location growth for a property investor is an unearned increment of growth. For the most part, property investors do not live in the community they buy real estate within. And so they add absolutely no value to the local community. They don't go, they're not part of the local public realm. They're not part of the local council. They're not part of the local sports clubs. They add no value. So they get the value of other people putting in the effort, the sweat equity to build community in the location they buy real estate in. So they get unearned growth from that perspective, an unearned increment of growth. Of course, the final growth, which is really behavioral or differentiated growth, can be earned by a property investor. They can choose the land they want to buy. They can choose the view they're going to get. So they can earn that growth themselves through simply buying a good property. So market growth unearned, deal growth earned, location growth unearned, and behavioral growth earned. That's really how the Forex growth plan comes together. But today, we're cracking that code. Does infrastructure create capital growth in real estate? And of course, when we look at the results of that Dulwich Hill example, it certainly did create growth in real estate. And of course, you can split down the increments of that growth into three phases, typically from infrastructure. When a project is announced, when construction starts, and when construction has been completed and the infrastructure is operating. Now, a classic example of a fair amount of demand chasing infrastructure growth and productivity just based off an announcement has been the amount of people buying in Brisbane off the back of the Olympic Games. Really, construction hasn't even started for the Brisbane Olympic Games. At the moment, the powers that be really don't even know what their game plan is. They seem to have won that Olympics with actually no real, plan as to even what the Olympic Stadium looks like, which kind of blows my mind how they actually ended up winning it. I don't know if there was a bag of carrots on the side or something, but wow. Nevertheless, there has been a lot of capital growth in the Brisbane market, particularly off the back of that Olympic announcement. So obviously, the free ride of the Olympics, which is 100% guaranteed to go ahead, has created a free riding effect of people buying in Brisbane and getting capital growth. And people who have bought in Brisbane have not added any value to the real estate. They've simply ridden market performance of capital growth off the back of that infrastructure announcement of the Brisbane 2032 Olympics. And of course, there will be further growth when construction starts, because that's going to create a pressure on wages. And when wages grow, that's a form of inflationary growth, and you will see that real estate is a hedge with inflation and you get more capital growth. And of course, when the Olympic Games is done and completed and operating, the stadiums, the pools, the infrastructure left behind, you should also get a benefit where certain pieces of infrastructure are basically there forever and people start to gravitate to that infrastructure, and off the back of that, you start to get even an increase in land value around some of that infrastructure. Some of the infrastructure will be temporary, but certainly some of the infrastructure created in the Olympic Games will be permanent, and because it will be permanent, it will create capital growth. So the cause and effect of infrastructure is important for property investors. There's a lot of evidence of past capital growth from infrastructure. You can go back as far as, for example, the M7, a motorway in Sydney, literally opening up, which basically took people through and out to certain pockets of Sydney, out to Windsor, which was a really disconnected part of Sydney. It opened up a link through North Connects, which opened up the northern corridor of the outer suburbs of Sydney. And you can examine that one piece of infrastructure absolutely game changed the marketplace back all the way back then. And while much of Sydney was starting to flag, prices in that precinct around the M7, the change benefit due to that infrastructure provision was a further 22% capital gain just from that M7 infrastructure story back all the way back in 2005. You can go to sort of a similar story from a motorway in Melbourne. Back in 2004, the government basically announced construction had begun for the Melbourne East Link roadway, and there was more capital growth around the East Link suburbs than the average Greater Melbourne neighbourhoods. And certainly by the time the East Linked suburbs were going through that open phase of basically the roadway opening, the capital growth was huge. It was around 26% more than the Melbourne greater marketplaces, just affecting those suburbs located on that infrastructure line known as the Melbourne East Link roadway. So 3 stages of impact: when a project is announced, when construction starts, and when completion and operation has unfolded. So in some respects, Brisbane could go through a double property market cycle just off the back of its infrastructure. I mean, obviously it's had some uplift in value in recent years off the back of basically fair market pricing, and also off the back of the Brisbane Olympic Games being announced. And, of course, off the back of that, you can now start to see the construction phase. So what will that do to the property market? What shortages will that create? What extra population growth will that create in Brisbane? I'm sure it's going to have a positive effect, certainly on property values and land values in Brisbane, which will be great. So evidence-based investing is what I think is important for people, and you can do your own research and find evidence that infrastructure, particularly transport infrastructure, can raise land values in catchment areas by 20 to 30%. Which I've certainly been the beneficiary of. Remember, in 2014, I did nothing amazing for society, but society handed me 30% capital growth on my property in a neighbourhood whereby 26 million taxpayers paid for a tram to come to my neighbourhood, and I did nothing. That is really the conversation piece here. So if we look at market game changers when it comes to unearned incremental growth from infrastructure, there are heaps of things happening at the moment. WestConnex Sydney, it's just opened, a large proportion of it. It's freaking fantastic. It's a big tunnel system that can get you all the way around Sydney, or not all the way around Sydney, to a certain areas of Sydney, which just open up movement. Like nothing worse than sitting in traffic for 3 hours a day and how unproductive that is. Sydney Metro, this one just opened and it is already spoken as a game changer. Sydney's actually got some really good infrastructure opening at the moment. Sydney Metro is basically a new train line that takes you from the northern suburbs to the inner western suburbs of Sydney. To do that, normally you would have to go over the Harbour Bridge by car, and it's just a horrible journey. Now you don't even need a car, and you can do it in like 15 minutes based on this Metro new train line, basically, that actually goes underneath Sydney Harbour. It's like a tunnel. It's actually an amazing piece of engineering. If you ever can catch a video on it, you'll be super impressed. And sometimes infrastructure, when it's produced, all of a sudden society kind of hates it or votes on it. And Sydney has voted on the Sydney Metro. Absolutely love it. Can take you from Chatswood to Sydenham, which in itself sounds like a horrible trip in a car, but underground in 15, 20 minutes in the fastest train in Australia, it's a game changer. So it will game change values on that line for sure. You'll see an uplift in values. Melbourne Metro Tunnel, this one's again really a tunnel which will benefit again certain suburbs on that train line. You've got upgrades basically around Sunshine to Footscray all the way into Parkville. And again, I think you will see an upgrade in land values just along that particular tunnelway. And I've already invested around there because I'm lazy and I just want a free ride because everyone else is paying for it. So I've done nothing special this year either, and I'm going to be the beneficiary of that particular transport infrastructure. Melbourne to Brisbane Inland Rail is happening, and obviously, again, will benefit both Brisbane and Melbourne when it comes to moving their produce and interstate sales and using two of the biggest ports in Australia, being the Port of Melbourne and the Port of Brisbane. So I think both cities are going to benefit from that rail line, as will obviously the agriculture along that rail line be getting their products to the world market a lot quicker. So again, just fantastic. You've got the Westgate Tunnel in Victoria, in Melbourne. Again, it's going to benefit some of those inner western suburbs of Melbourne. Cross River Rail, Queensland. I've already free-ridden this one. Wow, what capital growth around that particular neighbourhood. Woolloongabba, Kangaroo Point. I mean, I've literally put people into free rides in that neighborhood and watched them make over $1 million just from really a combination of Olympic Games, Cross River Rail, as well as just picking the right real estate. So the free ride works, folks. The free ride works. Obviously, you've got the Western Sydney Airport, which is a big game changer for Western Sydney, and we'll talk a little bit about that further. We've got also the MetroNet in Perth, which I know is already creating capital growth along that northern corridor in Perth. Now, remember, Australia's got a big population game by 2046. It's going to add something like another 8 or 9 million people to its population base. So you got to bring the infrastructure to also house the population. Otherwise, it just becomes unbearable to live in certain places. So infrastructure is really important for the idea of opening up jobs and giving Australia a bigger population, basically. So if we analyse the crane index in Melbourne, we can see that there are still a lot of cranes in the Melbourne marketplace. But what's very encouraging about Melbourne's crane index is you've got a lot of commercial and civil cranes and health cranes adding hospitals, roads, and jobs to the marketplace. It's not just based around residential. And so Melbourne's got a lot of activity happening in its health sector. Cranes were placed on, for example, Frankston Hospital, St. Vincent's Hospital. You've got cranes on the new Footscray Hospital, which is just driving economic development around that particular area. And of course, you've got the Melbourne Suburban Rail Loop, which is really the rail loop between Cheltenham and Box Hill is definitely going to provide property increases in those on that particular line, the South Rail Line East section of the Suburban Rail Loop. It's going to game change really what kind of jobs are put on that rail line. Remember, the infrastructure will just get people to jobs faster, so people like living close to where they work. And of course, if there's jobs near where you live, it makes people fight over the available land around where the job centres are. And that in itself pushes up property values. Of course, Brisbane, has a lot going for it with the Olympics. It's got a lot of civil activity, commercial activity underway. And certainly over in Perth as well, you've got that, as mentioned, that infrastructure project around the MetroNet. Sydney, though, is a good example of infrastructure now coming into a phase where it's gone through an idea to construction to now being used. And it will be interesting to perhaps do some research on the capital growth rates in a year or two time around some of the big projects coming to market. Now, probably the biggest one which will game change Sydney is Sydney's second airport is 18 months away from operating. Singapore Airlines just signed up as the first international carrier and will do international flights to Western Sydney. Now, this is a bit of a game changer, and I'm sure there's a lot of listeners not from Sydney, so you don't really get all of the Sydney news at a national level. You probably, if you hear the news, you're listening to news where you live locally. But Sydney is a big place. It's a massive city. There's sort of 5.5 million people in Sydney, and will become a city of 8 million people in our lifetime. But Sydney's airport is a curfewed airport. It shuts at 10:30 at night, and it's located actually on the coast of Sydney, where generally there is quite an affluent level of its populace. And to get to Sydney Airport, you really need to be able to live, in a reasonable distance to it. If you live in Sydney's Western Corridor, then it's a very, very difficult thing to use at the best of times because of sheer amount of transport and traffic delays to get to it. So for 50 years, Sydney's been analysing where to put a second airport. And if you think of global cities, London, New York, they all have alternative airports other than, like, Heathrow's one airport, but Gatwick's a second airport in London. And of course, it allows for just more business to flow into other sectors of the economy. And if I think of Sydney Airport, I really think of it as a white collar airport. Like, if you're doing business in the financial services, you're probably keen to jump to Sydney Airport because 15 minutes later, 20 minutes later, you can be in the CBD of Sydney. You could be at the Opera House in 25 minutes from Sydney Airport, doing a financial lunch with a banker. It's a great airport for that. But if you're in logistics, if you're, a main player in basically industrial, it's not a great airport because Sydney's industrial estates are much, much further out. And this is where Sydney's second airport will play a pivotal role in productivity growth for Sydney and job growth for Sydney. And as a correlation, you'll get property value growth for properties around the Sydney second airport, the Western Sydney Airport. Now, for 50 years, Badgerys Creek was identified as the place for Sydney Airport for Sydney to do its second airport. And for 50 years, there was all sorts of fights going on, but eventually it got approved. And of course, when that approval was announced, land values skyrocketed around Badgerys Creek. And of course, zoning changes happened around Badgerys Creek from basically rural residential to today, rural cow paddocks have now industrial zoning. And they have industrial zoning because it's not just about airport, I guess the airport itself providing passengers comfort. It's about what type of affiliated jobs you can create around the airport. Now, I think we've all been to, for example, secondary airports around the country. You can go to Avalon in Geelong, Melbourne, and there's obviously a little bit of infrastructure around it, and for the most part, it's a pretty basic airport. Sydney's second airport is not going to be a sort of domestic second choice airport for a low cost airline. Basically, it's going to be a international airport. And as I alluded to, Singapore Airlines just signed up for the Western Sydney Airport. So it's huge. It's basically a $6 billion airport. It's going to begin operating in 2026. It's going to be surrounded by what is known as an aerotropolis. It's going to have new roadways, new rail lines, and it's going to also drive land values up, and it's going to allow for an extra 300,000 people to live in that catchment and work in that catchment. And again, because Sydney's got a curfew airport, the Western Sydney Airport will alleviate that. All of a sudden you can take off to Singapore, 12 o'clock at night and 1 in the morning, and it'll open up so many business routes, which is just going to be fantastic for Sydney. Sometimes it's difficult to get flights to Sydney internationally at certain times of the day because the planes have to land at a certain time of the day and are cut off at 10:30 at night. So, if you're trying to plan a 12-hour flight from Japan, or I don't know, from Dallas, you've got to take all that into consideration. And of course, then you've got to be able to find the runways and it's a bit of a battle for airlines. They battle for the time slots and the runways and the airport access. So this is going to be huge, right? This is going to be huge. And you can do some videoing, you can do some YouTubing rather of Sydney's second airport. Go check it out. It's going to absolutely do some good things for the city of Sydney, which is just marvelous. I think it's great. Anyway, I live in Sydney. So just remember, like, infrastructure will create a level of growth and productivity in society. And as a property investor, we can choose to understand how aggregate demand works. Now, aggregate demand is just the concept that really the populace votes for what they want. Now, if you were to think about where most buyers are shopping today, aggregate demand, basically most downsizers, homeowners and investors as a combo are shopping in Southeast Queensland. Aggregate demand is saying Southeast Queensland right now is very hot with what people want. They want those lifestyle choices. Aggregate demand by government is the concept we're talking about. Government is saying we want people to live around this airport. Government is saying we want jobs around this airport. Government is saying we're going to put a train line around this airport. Government is voting to basically create a level of demand somewhere where when they approve and pay and deliver infrastructure. Really, the concept of getting a free ride off that growth is what we're talking about today. So, does infrastructure create capital growth in real estate? I think the answer is yes. I'll let you be the judge, but hey, thanks for tuning in again to the Urban Property Investor, and I'll catch you on the next episode. I think we cracked that code of infrastructure. Talk soon. Thanks for tuning in to the Urban Property Investor. To never miss an episode, make sure you subscribe to the podcast on your favorite app or on YouTube. I would love it if you could give the show a rating and share it with your friends and family. In between episodes, you can always keep in touch with me by connecting on social media over Facebook, Instagram, or LinkedIn. Until we meet again on the next episode of the Urban Property Investor, take care and bye for now.